works of local architect Ralph Fournier have spanned 4 decades of the 20th century and have had a tremendous impact on the physicality of the St. Louis suburban landscape. Mr. Fournier's architectural career lasted from 1949 through 1989 and produced hundreds of houses in the St. Louis suburbs. Mr. Fournier grew up in Holyoke, Massachusetts, worked evening shifts in an armory for several years, and eventually enlisted in the Air Force, where he served 4 missions before World War II ended in 1945. Upon returning from the military in 1946, Mr. Fournier apprenticed for 2 architects in Massachusetts, enrolled in an architectural engineering program, and eventually transferred to Washington University in St. Louis, where he received a degree in architecture in 1952. During that time, Ralph Fournier began working with Burton Dinky, a local developer with vision for modern residential development in the St. Louis suburbs.
He was looking for a draftsman at the time and put up a poster at WashU, and from there I applied for the job and got that in '49 and worked for him Saturdays and Thursday night for all the time I was in college. The first subdivision I did for him was a traditional house. I think it was called Webster Hills. It was on Grant Road, across the street from Ridgewood subdivision. So we did just traditional stuff at that time. I think he didn't have a lot of money. He worked for his father. His father was a big builder in South St. Louis during the Depression, and did a lot of houses, one house a day. And he worked as a roofer for his father. And then when he got married, his wife had some money, and they started doing subdivisions.
Mr. Fournier continued to work with Dinky all throughout his years in school, and was thus able to receive his architectural license shortly after he graduated architecture school in 1952.
And when we started at WashU, the school had converted from classical, where you had to study all the columns and the Corinthian capitals and things like that, to the contemporary. And so we were starting to do the flat roof houses and Mies van der Rohe, and we had a gentleman by the name of Roth that came from Switzerland, and he was one of our instructors. And I took a sculpturing class from Richard Dumey at art school, and that was interesting because we were working on sculptured heads, and you worked the whole head, front and back. And so if you applied that to your architecture, you worked your houses front and back. And so a lot of the houses that I did later on, or even there, because we could flip those plans in Ridgewood, you flip them, you could move the fireplace, the front door, the windows, then you'd add the carport wherever it would work. And so you've got a lot of variation. There was very few houses that were just flat houses looking at you with a garage or something like that on the side. The rest of them were, carports.
Upon completion of that first subdivision project with Burton Dinky, the team began collaborating on projects that were modern in aesthetics and constructed of modular components.
Then we went into Ridgewood and Huntley Hills, and a couple other ones. Went over to Craig Woods. I did some for Sunswept. There was a Sunswept East on Lindbergh, and there was a Sunswept West out near St. Luke's Hospital. And then Arrowhead, we did some stuff at Arrowhead, which was a Burton Dinky development. That was an interesting development because Burton, who was a really fantastic guy, even though he didn't have much education, he had a tremendous brain and could foresee a lot of things. And we just walked through that forest. It was a forest, and he had the bulldozer man drive behind him, and they ran the road by walking through the woods. And so that's how it was all laid out, was just by having a bulldozer right behind him and the leading guy who owned the tractor, the bulldozer.
The subsequent modern projects that Mr. Fournier designed with Burton Dinky were primarily constructed of modular components, meaning they were constructed of prefabricated panels that were shipped to the residential sites for ease of construction.
Then we got into the modular homes, which was the Ridgewood house, and that was a system of post and beams, eliminated the trusses, eliminated the basements, did just a foundation, and the foundation was a was just a backhoe that would dig like a 10-inch trench. It didn't have any footing, it just had a 10-inch trench, and then a formwork at the top to receive the slab from the inside and the partitions, the 6'4" partitions on the outside. The slab was poured after the roof was on, so that saved as far as rainy days and things like that. They could still finish off the houses. Rainy days, they could still work on the prefabs out at Modular Homes, and then bring that out and set up the structure on a sunny day.
The result of designing the houses to be constructed of prefabricated modular components was that they could be quickly and efficiently constructed, thereby cutting down on construction time and ultimately cutting cost.
The modular plans had partitions that were 2'4", 4'4", and 6'4". So if you wanted to have a little larger house, just by adding a 2'4" one, you'd get 2'4" more depth, more length. Or you could go 6'4" if the lot was deep enough that you could go backwards. In one day, they could put the roof on and side panels, partitions, I shouldn't say that, post and beams, the center beam, the roof rafters, the sheathing, the roofing, and then the panels on the outside. And then the second day, they'd pour the slab. It went pretty fast. It was a quick. The houses were cheaper. Young people coming out of the war or coming out of college could buy a house probably for about the same amount that they spent on renting an apartment. We bought a house in 1953, 52, and in there on Paddock Court, and it was $14,400, as I remember, 4.5% GI loan. So that was pretty fair deal. Didn't have a lot of money, so we could afford to do that, buy a small house. And then there was like 6 other architects that were from WashU that moved in. So there were a lot of young people that were in there, just married.
Cutting costs on constructing the building structure and envelope meant that more attention to detail could be paid to the interior of these houses.
By saving the basement, we were probably saving $1,000. Therefore, you could do more things with the interior of the house. We also saved on the trusses because we didn't have to buy a truss. We did a lower pitch. I think the pitch was 2 and 12. The bedrooms weren't too big. We had a utility room. The hall was short, so you didn't have a lot of square footage being wasted there. You got a high ceiling with the post and beam construction. So it gave it a little architectural pizzazz. And then by flipping the house, you could get different views coming out of the house. You could move the windows around, move the fireplace around. So you got a tremendous amount of different vistas of the exterior. It wasn't just a subdivision of boxes that were planted. And as one surveyor said, boy, this is expensive to lay out. Because in the regular ones where you had just boxes, he could stand at the end of the street and lay them all out. And you'd get the front yard all worked out and set up as pins, and off they'd go. Whereas here you had almost to survey the house plan individually, because it always rotated all the way down through the subdivision. And then it gave a lot more character to all of the exteriors. By keeping the price down, the cost down, you could sell to more people. And so you were getting not only the people that were happy with contemporary architecture, you were getting other people that were happy because the price was low instead of high. And it was kind of more interesting, I think, even for the person that was more of a traditionalist.
Like many architects of this era, sketching was a tremendously important part of the design process.
I did a lot of sketching, and when I do my sketching, I would do bird's eye views, so you could see the roof structure, the ins and outs, the form. You could get things that were projected or things that were recessed. So you got highlights and you got depressions. It was like designing the face of a beautiful person. You had good proportions, good color, small ears, all kinds of things like that you'd want to design. And so when you were doing that layout or doing a perspective from a bird's eye view, you could see all of this going in and out. Where light came in, sunlight would hit certain areas and it would become more outstanding and would come forward. Things like depressions with carports or windows or items that would recess like the front door or the portico. Bay windows were very interesting because you did get a chance to get some in and out stuff there. So basically that's what I would play around with. The bird's eye view sketches were very important to handle. So you could do the sketch of a bird's eye view of the exterior as well as do the planning at the same time. And sometimes what I'd do is go home, so I didn't have the phone or the other guys around, so I could go home for maybe a half a day and work on a design for a new client. And that way you could work and play, and it's like molding clay, except that you're working with a pencil.
Despite the practicality of modular modern house designs of the 1950s, few residences are constructed today using modular techniques.
Good planning doesn't mean that you have to have a big white elephant like we build nowadays. And I think some of these people are suffering right now because of mortgages that are too high to pay off. Yeah, I don't know why they couldn't be repeated, as a prefab. It was just a method of prefabrication. There was all kinds. There was the lustron. There's 5 houses just south of me that are lustron, all metal, and they're still in good shape. They're all porcelain siding, porcelain roofs. A clever idea. I don't know why they wouldn't reproduce as well now as they did then. I don't know why we couldn't do the same type of houses and go ahead and change it. We might have a lot different siding because the redwoods are probably gone. Windows would be different, but we could certainly have large panes in places in order to make it open. And then the big pane made it interesting because you could look in the house as well. So you had inside, outside, and you could relate like a patio or something right into the living room. So things were could be done and redone and rebuilt very similar to what you were doing, except you'd have to spend a little time on the siding and maybe a different foundation result or a different slab, different heating systems. Solar, we got solar to play with and wind to play with. So there's all kinds of different material things that have shown up in the last 50 years that were not applied at that time. Because at that time, some of the times we thought about which way was the wind coming from, so that you could get a little breeze going through the kitchen or through a bedroom.
After a career that spanned 4 decades, Mr. Fournier retired in the late 80s. Since then, he has turned his focus from architecture to painting and volunteering for his church and local elementary school.
I retired in '89, and I tried to slip architecture out of my mind. I'd had enough. I'd worked from about 46 until '89, and I was more interested. I always wanted to be a painter. I didn't want to be an architect, but being an architect, you made a few bucks. Whereas if you took and did painting, you didn't make a lot of money. And so that was one of the reasons that I got into architecture.
Despite Mr. Fournier's shift in focus from architecture to art in the decades following his retirement, his impact on suburban St. Louis, and more importantly, his impact on the lives of those who still live in his houses, remains clear. It is evident that Ralph Fournier always designed his projects with people in mind, and provided inspiring and affordable houses during an era where there was great need. When asked to reflect on his modern house designs of the 1950s, he remembers.
Was that you could put bedrooms on the silent side of the house, the dark side of the house, put the living spaces on the sunny side of the house, kitchens and things like that where people are spending a lot more time, and they could spend that time in the sunny, happier side of the house. The one thing about my life is I was able to do something great in that direction as for people. I think the thing I was doing was trying to do small houses that satisfied the people that didn't have a lot of money We did work. That's about all. I think that I'm at the end of my fuse.
We covered a lot.
Yeah, that's great.
Did I?
This is fantastic.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, guys?